Hey Kelly, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, good, I think.
I, you think? Why? What's going on in your world?
You know, it's just always interesting working in advocacy right now when you don't have access to the Capitol
Yeah.
and it's a budget year and it's a deficit year and it's a pandemic year and it's interesting.
That's such a Minnesotan way of putting that. I'm sure it's very challenging.
It is, but we'll get through it.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Let's start by talking about the work of the Greater Minnesota Partnership. So, can you give me a brief overview of what your work is?
Sure. So the Greater Minnesota Partnership really focuses in on advocating for state public policies and investments that promote economic prosperity in Greater Minnesota. And so you know, we're really trying to figure out what are the barriers or opportunities that we have for job expansion, job growth, workforce development throughout all of Greater Minnesota to make sure our communities are strong, our businesses are healthy, and our residents are thriving. A lot of the issues we look at are housing. Broadband right now is a really key issue as everybody's kind of realized the shortcomings that we have, childcare, and just some of those big issues that we have.
Sure. So, when did you join the partnership and in what role?
So I've been with the partnership for about 2 years now. The partnership started about 8 years ago when a number of city leaders and business leaders across Greater Minnesota kind of came together and realized that we needed a new voice for advocating for economic prosperity in Greater Minnesota. And so at the time when it started, we hired Dan Dorman, a former legislator and economic development director from Albert Lee, to be the executive director, and he's moving towards slowly into retirement right now. And so the board brought me on board on the 1st of January to take over from Dan in that position.
Great. How's it going? How's it been going since January 1st?
It's interesting. It's an interesting time to be an advocate in Minnesota. Obviously, the pandemic is impacting everybody, but around the state capitol, the building is accessible to staff and legislators, and
Mhm.
everybody else is outside.
Yeah.
Um, we still have a fence around the capitol from
Right.
the the issues this summer,
Mhm.
and so it's an interesting time to try and champion public policies when there's a split between those who are making the decisions and those who are trying to educate policymakers and advocate on behalf of the issues we care about.
Yeah, is that changing how you approach your role?
It is. It used to be that, I'd walked 10,000 steps by 9 o'clock in the morning, and now I stand in my office in a Zoom call all day
Yeah.
long.
Yeah,
And
right.
so, it is interesting. All of committee hearings are online. And so it's a very different system that we have right now because those who have access to testifying are much more organized by those who are holding the hearings. And so there's less opportunity for the public, frankly, to engage in the process. It's more transparent from everybody can access it,
Mhm.
but it's less accessible to those who want to be in there engaging in the process. So, hopefully as the weeks go on, the legislature figures out how to do things a little bit better.
Mhm.
But it's they've got work to get done. We have to have a budget done by the end of June for the next fiscal biennium. So they really can't stop what they're doing. They've got to keep going forward.
Right. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the work you want to do in your first year. So, what are your goals in terms of successes of the Greater Minnesota Partnership in your first year?
For me, success is defined by two different areas. One is how are we doing the Capitol on championing these issues? One of the challenges we have this year on this is the state's facing a budget deficit. And so, between now and when session wraps up in the middle of May, the state needs to set the budget. They need to address a $1.2 billion budget deficit. And so that's likely going to mean a conversation between budget cuts, which could impact areas that are important for Greater Minnesota,
Mhm.
and it could, deal with discussions about tax increases. And so, obviously, in the next 6 months, we want to be really involved in those conversations and make sure that the priorities of Greater Minnesota are heard and acted upon. But also beyond that, we have an organization we're dealing with, and so how do we grow the organization? How do we make it more impactful? We are a membership organization made up of local governments, businesses, chambers of commerce, higher education, nonprofits, and so on and so forth. And so, the health and vitality of the organization and our ability to be impactful it's really driven by those that we have at the table. And so one of the things I want to see over the next 2 to 3 years is growth in our membership so that we have the voices and we're being informed by those who are on the ground in greater Minnesota about what are the issues they're facing. And more importantly, what are the solutions? What are the ideas that we have out there for how we address the housing crisis in greater Minnesota, how we address the childcare shortage, how we deal with these challenges we do have.
How do you select what priorities you're going to put forward in a legislative session? Is that based on the stakeholders and feedback from them?
Yep. So we've had a board of directors made up of all the different stakeholders. Everybody has representation. It's elected by the membership. And so, they work through the process and go from there. The reality is a lot of these issues have been around for a while. The housing crisis in the greater Minnesota isn't a new thing. We know it's really hard to make the finances work for new construction in a lot of our communities, but they do change. Two examples. One is 3 years ago, childcare wasn't a big priority for us. And then it has exploded for us. And we realized that businesses are now making decisions about what communities to locate in and what communities to grow in with availability of childcare for their employees as being a top variable that they make the decision on. That's crazy that we're at the point that something like childcare is something that, business executives are sitting around talking about, but it's the reality that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
Another one, obviously, this year that has really exploded for us is broadband. It's an issue that we've been working on for some time, but it's there's a very different view on it now because we realize as students have been in virtual learning over the past 10 months, as workers have not been in their offices, that reduced broadband capacity in the community is a real hindrance to some of these things going forward. And so there's a renewed energy around it, both at the federal level and the state level. And so, we're more active on that issue now than we have been in the past couple of years anyway.
Okay. Well, I'm curious. So has there been successes in terms of broadband and childcare and those other top issues in the past years? And if so, what do successes look like this year? What do you want to achieve in terms of those topics?
Yeah. So on the broadband front, we were instrumental a few years back in establishing the state's border-to-border broadband program, which is a grant program really aimed at let's get broadband access to everybody that needs to have it. And so, we've got goals for the state for where we need to be by 2022, which is just around the corner.
Yeah, it is.
As well as 2026. And so the key thing for that is we know what we need to spend to make it happen, and we know the time frame that we need to do with it. And so, we've got proposals that we're working on with a broader coalition focused on, in the next biennium, getting $120 million in new investment in broadband expansion.
Okay.
The governor's budget came out this week with a proposal for $50 million for it, which we know isn't enough to get us to that 2026 goal. And so we're going to be working on, let's shore up more revenue, more resources to do this program so that we can get it going forward. So, that's some of the things that we're working on in broadband. We do know that there's more money coming from the federal government on from some of the COVID response that they've had. So we still need to kind of see, what the total pool is going to be for Minnesota and how we best use those dollars to make sure not only that families have access, but that the businesses have access to the speed that they need to have. Because the reality is, whether you're in, St. Paul, Minneapolis, or Alexandria, or Virginia, you need good internet access to be able to participate in the global economy.
Mm-hmm. Right. And with everything virtually online right now, it's I'm sure more important than ever.
Absolutely.
Well, we've kind of covered this ground a little bit, but I wanted to talk about challenges that are facing Outstate Minnesota right now. So what do those look like for you, and how do you plan to advocate for those at the Capitol?
Sure. We have a lot of great opportunities in greater Minnesota, but we do have challenges. It's been interesting to see kind of the response to the COVID pandemic. You wander through downtown Minneapolis or downtown St. Paul, and they're pretty sparse as far as workers in there right now.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those folks are at their cabins in greater Minnesota working. And so part of our question is, what does the economy in greater Minnesota look like as we get, a year or two outside of COVID?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have the point in which the big downtown Minneapolis law firms have their employees scattered across the state working? And what does that mean for us moving forward? We know that we have a lot of great job opportunities in greater Minnesota, but we don't always have the workforce that we need. And so, what does workforce reform and workforce retraining look like going forward? Obviously one of the big challenges I have head on is the housing situation. It's really hard to get new housing construction built in Greater Minnesota
Mhm.
because a lot of times the cost to build is greater than what the cost or the value that property is going to be appraised at once it's done. And so, how do you get past that private sector equilibrium point without some sort of state intervention in those issues? And so, I think there are issues we need to be working on this session for some immediate response, especially as we deal with the COVID pandemic. But a lot of what we need to be looking at is, how do we deal with things over the next 3 to 5 years to make sure that we're starting to make some of these changes, moving them forward. One of the things that we look at frequently at from a policymaker standpoint is how do we create solutions for statewide issues. But the reality is, in a lot of situations, those problems look different in different geographic areas. So on the housing side, there's a housing issue in both the metro and greater Minnesota. In the metro, it's more affordability. Prices are just really high, but the market's still there to support those values. Well, we've got the flip situation in greater Minnesota. On childcare, again, childcare is available in the metro, but it's really expensive. We're lacking 40,000 childcare slots in greater Minnesota right now. And a lot of it just has to do with the fact that our families can't afford to pay what providers need to have a profitable business.
Mhm.
And so one of the things we're trying to do is, can we change the conversation in policy making to get people to realize that maybe we need different solutions for different entities on the same problem. So I think that's one of the big things that I want to see us really trying to work with policymakers on in the next year or so.
Okay, great. Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about long-term goals. So, you're executive director now of the Greater Minnesota Partnership. When you step back in however many years when you're done with the role, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want the partnership to have achieved?
That's a great question. Part of what I want to see is that we are a true, strong, solid voice for Greater Minnesota. One of the things that was a catalyst for the start of this organization was some work done by the Center for Rural Policy and Development back 8 or 9 years ago,
Mhm.
where they asked the question, who is the voice for Greater Minnesota? Um, and the conclusion they had is, well, there are pockets of voices, but there isn't necessarily a voice.
Mhm.
And so, we started with the intent of filling that void, and I think we're doing a good job with it. But we need to do a better job with it. Again, it's how do we make sure that we're representing, all corners of the state, all issues. One of the things I usually start my presentations off when talking about Greater Minnesota is just how big of a state Minnesota actually is.
Right.
So one of the things I usually, lead off with is, um, you could take a Saturday and you could drive from Grand Portage up in the northeast corner down to Laverne, down in the southwest corner,
Mhm.
or we
Right.
can drive, and I'm usually at that point in St. Paul or Minneapolis doing the presentation, or we can take that same day and drive from where we are to Chicago and catch the first 7 innings of the Cubs game, because it's an equivalent amount of time to do those two activities.
Mhm.
And so, one of the challenges that we do have representing Greater Minnesota is, how do we fully represent Greater Minnesota? You've got the mines and the forestry industries in northern Minnesota. You've got ag in the southern part of the state. How do you balance the needs of all of these entities as a statewide organization? So I think that's one of the things that I really want to focus in on in the coming years, is how do we make sure that we're fully representative of the collection of issues that we have going on.
Okay. Well, that must be difficult somewhat in your role to balance all of those issues and make sure the voices are heard at the legislature, I'm assuming.
It is, it's interesting because we are a very diverse economy and a very diverse state, um, but at the same time, we're very homogenous. We all kind of view the issues through a similar lens, and although we have a wide variety of things going on, I see more commonality between the north and south of Minnesota than
Mhm.
at times we see between the metro and greater Minnesota. So it's
Mhm.
it's a challenge just from a geographic standpoint, but there is a strong bond between the region.
Sure. I'm curious, let's chat a little bit about the commonalities between the metro part of the state and the rural part of the state. What do those look like for you?
The commonalities really are, we all want to see the state do better.
Mhm.
You know, when we think about the opportunities for Minnesota, we need a strong and vibrant metropolitan area, and we need a strong and vibrant greater Minnesota. And so if one of us isn't doing what needs to be done, then the other one's not going to do as well. When you look at the economic vitality in the metro, a lot of it is driven by what's going on in greater Minnesota. We're a big food state. When you look at General Mills and CHS and Land O'Lakes and whatnot, those products aren't being grown or developed in the metropolitan area. They're coming out of greater Minnesota. And so even though we view it often as the metro and greater Minnesota being two separate things, economically, they're very tied closely together. And so, I think we need to pay attention to that reality that, workers in greater Minnesota are tied to workers in the metro and vice versa, and make sure that we are keeping those linkages in our policy discussions.
Great. That's a great reminder for everyone. Well, Scott, I think that was everything I wanted to ask. So is there anything else you wanted to add in or mention?
I think, the one thing I'd love to just throw out there is, for a lot of people in the metro, we don't always get out to greater Minnesota. A lot of folks talk, they'll head up north and they'll talk about going to, the Brainerd Lakes area, which truly is north of the metropolitan area. Right. A whole lot of Minnesota that's north of the Brainerd Lakes area. And so, I just encourage folks, take time to get out into Minnesota. One of the things that we saw from the pandemic is, March, April, May were tough months for our resort industries, but the summer was some of the best months that a lot of them have had. And it came about because people weren't traveling to Europe in the summer. And so they decided to go, have the family vacation somewhere in Minnesota, which was great to see. And I hope that sticks around as we move forward. But there's a lot of great stuff going on in the state, and a lot of really cool communities and a lot of great things to do. And so I just encourage people, take advantage of these opportunities, hit the road, go see what's going on in some of these communities, but there's a lot of exciting things going on.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks for the conversation, Scott. It was super interesting, and I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Kelly.
Yeah. Bye now.
See ya.